last speaker for the morning session will be Jonathon Tallon, and he's going to be speaking on a topic that I'm pretty interested in since I've read quite a bit of Jack Kerouac. It's the curious tale of Jack Kerouac's death in St. Petersburg, iconography, commemoration, and defining a legend. And Mr. Tallon has a background with a master's degree from the University of South Florida at St. Petersburg in Florida Studies, a BA in history from the University of South Florida, and another degree from St. Petersburg College. I'll let him start off right here.
Just to follow up on Mr. Kilby's presentation, there's an excellent book by Dan Warren about the civil rights movement in St. Augustine. He was the state attorney that was in charge. And if you're not as familiar with Florida being involved in the civil rights movement, that particular period was as bad as anything that went on in Alabama or Mississippi. It just doesn't really get as much publicity as those two spots. Get this going. Am I going that one? Lean in.
It's easier for me to do.
Yes, I would agree. Okay, there we go. Thank you very much. So for those of you that weren't aware, Jack Kerouac died here in St. Petersburg in 1969. It's probably the least interesting thing about his life. He died of acute alcoholism. His liver ruptured, and there was an attempt to save his life that involved, as it was reported in the St. Petersburg Times, about 28 bags of blood. But he did, in fact, shuffle off this mortal coil while he was here in St. Petersburg. I always tend to get a little aggravated when I ask people if they read On the Road or the Dharma Bums, and they give me a look like, Jack who? I am by training a historian, but the cool thing about the Florida Studies program was I was allowed to get out of the microfiche room in the library and take some literature classes. I went back to college a little later in life, so I was able to spend a little bit more time doing actual studying. One of the things that came up was one of my very good friends, Tom Halleck, is a professor of literature over at USF St. Pete, and he was always encouraging us to sort of get out of the library, stop reading, go out and do something. So one of the things that we did was we organized a Kerouac pub crawl. A few of the places that Jack used to go are still open here in St. Petersburg. So we sort of went on the road to see if Jack was still out there somewhere. So again, everybody, I am assuming, probably knows. If you don't know, Jack was the self-proclaimed king of the B writers. He, along with Allen Ginsberg and some of his contemporaries, really got that movement going. And Jack was really its face and its sort of its poster child. He probably wasn't the best writer of that period, but he certainly was one of the ones that made the most impact and got a lot more famous than maybe literarily he deserved. So this quote is actually from On the Road, where Sal Paradise, who is in fact Jack Kerouac, is describing Dean Moriarty. But really, there was so much about Jack that was so larger than life that that caught when I was putting this presentation together. I thought, yeah, that's kind of how I felt about Jack, because when I was a much younger man, and you've got that dog-eared copy of On the Road shoved in your backpack, and you're wandering around, a junior college campus, and you feel cool. You're like, yeah, I've got Kerouac with me. I'm good. But as I got older and started to reread Kerouac and find out some Jack's biographical data, in addition to the, yeah, it's cool that Kerouac drank here or whatever, but some more things about Jack. So my view of him changed quite a bit over time. So Jack was a drunk's drunk. This is the White Horse Tavern, which was frequented by Dylan Thomas, Jim Morrison, Hunter Thompson, Tom Wolfe. Every writer that passed through New York City went to this place at some point. Jack had gotten kicked out of there so many times that somebody scrawled over the urinal in the men's room, "Kerouac, go home." So again, that kind of tells you probably where Jack was most of his life. This is reportedly the last place that Jack had a drink in St. Petersburg. Now, a little difficult to prove. Some of the places that he used to go to are no longer there. Really, the only two that remain as they were largely is the Flamingo Sports Bar, which is on MLK, if you should have a free moment tonight to drive up there. And Cactus Charlie's, which is over on 34th Street, but I would not recommend going in there at all. It's a little sketchy. The cool thing about the Flamingo Sports Bar is it's the owner, who's still around, Dan Nichols, is a Vietnam vet. He bought the bar when he came back from Vietnam in 1969 and knew Jack pretty well. And mostly what he says about Jack is, yeah, he kind of wasn't really all there at that point. So, but they have sort of embraced this fact that Kerouac was there. And they've got the Kerouac pool tournament on Sunday, so if you're around Sunday afternoon or you're local and you haven't been there, the pool tournament, I think, gets going at 5 o'clock. And they've also got the Kerouac Wash, which is a very, very small snifter of beer and a very, very small snifter of bad whiskey. So, but it's $2.50. So that sort of handsome, raffish-looking guy that was in the first couple of slides, this is kind of what he looked like at the end. At the upper corner there, he's actually drunk on the William F. Buckley program in 1968. He was on the show about a year before he died. The video is on YouTube, and it's kind of what you think it is. He's sort of rambling incoherently and railing about the hippies and the sort of counterculture movement. That's actually a picture of Jack in the right-hand corner there. Was in the St. Petersburg Times. A reporter kind of tracked him down because he came to St. Petersburg primarily because he wanted to get away from his notoriety. Also, he did write in one of his letters that it was a good place to die, which is in fact what he did. So a self-fulfilling prophecy. So one of the reasons that Jack was here in St. Petersburg is because his mother was paralyzed most of her life. And that would be Mama Kerouac is the nice lady in the middle there. And the Kerouacs are in the local drinking tavern, which, again, tells you probably a lot more about Jack than anything else that I could impart here. But so Jack's third and last wife, Stella Sampras, is behind him in that picture in the lower corner there. And they lived in a couple of places in Florida over the middle part of the 60s. They were here in St. Petersburg twice, but lastly in 1969. This is the house where Jack lived. It's actually, I was born and raised here in St. Petersburg. I've lived off 58th Street and 22nd Avenue most of my life. I had a period where I went over to the East Coast of Florida, and I came back immediately because the East Coast is awful. Don't ever move to Fort Lauderdale. Not a good place. Anyway, you can see it's a rather nondescript house in a nondescript neighborhood right around the corner from a Walgreens, as is every home in Florida now, and a retirement community. This is where the story gets interesting. So Jack kicks off October 21st, 1969. And his mother dies in 1973. Stella moves out of the house, and they go off. Jack left everything he had in this world to his mother. And the last week of his life, he was wandering around St. Petersburg with a public shopping bag and a copy of On the Road, desperately looking for a divorce attorney so he could divorce his then current wife. So when Gabrielle Kerouac dies in 1973, she left everything to Stella Sampras, who was her primary caregiver, which was most of the reason Jack married her in the first place, so he could have somebody to take care of his mom. So Jack has one child. Her name is Jan Kerouac. She met him twice in her life, and Jan had hard life, to say the least. She was an author. She tried to get into acting. Alcoholism runs in the Kerouac family, and so it did with her. So she befriends a guy named GERALD Nicosia. Now, GERALD's actually a literature professor who wrote an amazing biography of Kerouac. If there's a first apostle in the Church of Kerouac, it's Professor Nicosia. The book's called Memory Babe, and it's really well done, really well researched. You got a lot of access to stuff, because Jack left a lot of stuff laying around. Right about the middle part of the 80s, Jan Kerouac was at a writers' conference, and she ran into John Steinbeck Jr. One of the things that John Steinbeck Jr. told her was that, by the way, you still own the intellectual property that your father had generated. So they start a long series of lawsuits. Unfortunately, Jan Kerouac never really saw anything come up. She died in the middle part of the 1990s, but Mr. NICOSIA, who was the executor of her estate, kept on with it. So at issue was this house, which has largely sat empty for them since about the mid-1970s. It's a little creepy. I've been in the backyard. Wait, are they videotaping this? I did not, just for the record, I did not go in the house. So Mr. NICOSIA continues this lawsuit, and one of the things that happens during this period between the death of Gabrielle Kerouac and the beginning of Jan Kerouac's lawsuit is Jack's stuff becomes real valuable. One of the things that the Stampus clan gets their hands on is the original scroll that Jack typed out on the Rodon. So also, Jack's stuff is just laying everywhere. It's here in St. Petersburg, it was in Orlando, it was back home in Lowell. Lo and behold, one of the Stampus neighbors is a young lady that was dating Johnny Depp. So Depp rolls over to the Stampus house and says, "Hey, do you have any of Jack's stuff?" And Steve Stampus says, "Yes, I've got some of Jack's stuff. What would you like?" "Well, I've got a briefcase, a hat, and a raincoat. I'll give you $50,000 for that." That sounds pretty good to me. So the commodification of Jack's personal memorabilia, his letters, everything else really started to kick into high gear in the mid-1990s, right when GERALD Nicosia and Jan Kerouac had begun their lawsuit, like, in earnest. So the long and tortured tale of this, Jack died in 1969, the house is still sitting empty, most of his stuff's laying around, and people are just in the mid-1990s discovering that you can commodify Kerouac's, both his intellectual property and the things he left behind. So this probate case, which started in 1993, doesn't get resolved until 2011. And the guy that resolved the case, who probably, I could have just done something on Judge GREER. So Judge GREER is one of the most well-respected judges that ever sat on the bench in Pinellas County. He also happened to be Jim Morrison's roommate at FSU and kicked Jim out of the house after he and the Kerouacs brothers had enough of Jim. They remember that Saturday Night Live sketch, The Thing That Wouldn't Leave? That was Jim Morrison. He went onto a drunken bender one night and started playing Elvis Presley's Return to Sender over and over and over again at a very high level, and the Kerouacs brothers and then George GREER asked him to leave the house in no uncertain terms. Jim spent the rest of the time in Tallahassee living in a pop-up trailer behind the girls' dormitory, oddly enough. And he also got into national prominence because he adjudicated the Terry Schiavo case. So, you know, Judge GREER's had a whole interesting career. So this is really one of the last things that he does before he retires. So what he ruled is that the will that the Stampus clan had from Gabrielle Kerouac was in fact a forgery. They appealed the case and lost. How do I know this? My mother is a paralegal here in St. Petersburg, and the attorney that handled the appeal of the case works in her office, and he talked to me briefly about it because he still is kind of upset about losing the case. So Jack's really only got one surviving heir at this point, and the executor of the Jan Kerouac estate. Jack's only living relative is a guy named Paul Blake, who's kind of an itinerant drifter out in Santa Monica, who really, you know, kind of Lebowski-esque, just sort of, you know, he just kind of abides, and really had no interest in having Jack's stuff or getting the house back or whatever. He really just wanted to see Uncle Jack's work, you know, properly represented. So we've got another precedent for this. You know, why are we're here talking about archaeology today and mid-century structures. Well, one of the structures where something in Jack's life of note that happened, he wrote the DHARMA bums outside of Winter Park at his uncle's place. Again, Jack was probably really an annoying guy. He used to sit out on that front porch there that he rigged up a light to a car battery and would sit out there and type all night. So I imagine the dead middle of the night in the early part of the 1960s, if somebody was banging away on a Royal typewriter, you know, at odd hours in the morning, I think I might be upset. So the gentleman in the corner there is a TV reporter in Orlando who was able to engineer the purchase of the Kerouac house, and they started the Kerouac Writers Project. So there's a submission process where they come and you're the writer in residence in the house where Jack Kerouac wrote the DHARMA bums, which is pretty neat. So they award that twice a year, and there's a stipend with it. So you know, it is a place for writing. They've restored the house. It's not in necessarily the greatest neighborhood in Winter Park. I don't know if any of you are familiar, but it's pretty well east of Rollins College, which you know, puts it in sort of an area that's in the middle of being gentrified right now. So one of the things that has occurred to some people is, well, why are we doing this? I mean, does Kerouac really still matter? We're still talking about this. He's been dead since 1969. You know, does On the Road need a rereading? And I think it does. I think the lesson here is not that Jack died in this tiny little house in St. Petersburg, but I think more importantly is that, you know, his work and his life need some reexamination. You know, he didn't have an Elvis Presley death where they've now turned Graceland into the most visited place in America, but you know, his work and the literary some masterpieces that he produced really, you know, I think it stood the test of time. You know, a lot of what Kerouac lived was a misreading of his life. He wasn't Dean Moriarty. He really was Sal Paradise. And this quote, and this is one of my favorite quotes, he's not talking about crazy people. He's not talking about people that are off balance. He's talking about people that are looking for something beyond them. And Jack was a Roman Catholic guy who really felt, much like John Coltrane did, that the written word, you know, or the music were able to get you in touch with God. So, you know, this is a chance really to not only reclaim Jack's iconography, but really reclaim his legacy from kind of a disastrous last half of his life. Thank you.